Thanks, everybody. Appreciate sticking around. Looks like most of the eyes are still open and the phones are down, so that's great. This is probably one of my favorite parts of getting to come out here to Pulse is really getting to see the different ideas and coming at the end of the day, we get to start bringing everything together. So we're gonna have some time for questions. Would love to hear them. And probably the first thing we want to do, obviously, gets kicked off with some introductions. Arlen, you got us started there, obviously, with the presentation.
What don't you know about me?
Yeah. Actually, one thing I didn't know was that you guys own Nerdist and a couple of the other things there, too.
We actually bundle them. So in that particular case, we have a commercial relationship with a lot of those brands. We own Rooster Teeth and Crunchyroll specifically, which are a part of the Verve aggregation service. And then we partner with the legendary brands, with High Dive, which is another anime service, and a bunch of other Shudder. And so all of those are commercial relationships where they are distributing through their own service and their own platform, as well as participating in Verve.
Right, so creating a little bit of a marketplace right there. Katelyn, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do.
Sure. So I'm Katelyn Coghlan, and I work for a tech startup, specifically a VR and AR startup in New York called the Glimpse Group. And what's very interesting about the company that I work for as the head of marketing is that that company is an alternative to startup investment in this space. So a lot of entrepreneurs in VR and AR typically go after VCs or go after incubators, and there's a lot of restrictions to those type of investments. So the Glimpse Group essentially hybridizes those forms of investment and gives these creators a platform to develop their solution on and create their projects on that's very synergistic and communal. So that is what I'm the head of marketing of, and then the subsidiary that I also run, because if anyone here has ever done any sort of tech startup entrepreneurship, you know that you wear multiple hats. So my second hat is the general manager of Init, and what Init does is it brings virtual and augmented reality to brands and agencies. So we do a lot of project-based work where we create VR and AR for large brands who want to experiment with it.
Sounds great. And you mentioned VCs just a minute ago. And go ahead and tell us a little bit about what you do there, Alan.
Hi, Alan Resnikoff. I'm with Shamrock Capital. We're a media and entertainment-focused investment firm. We're actually located just down the street, managing about $2 billion in capital. We do both growth equity and buyouts in the media and entertainment industries. My personal focus has been on sports and content-related companies, gaming-related companies, and increasingly VR and AR companies.
So, nope, still doesn't have it. Thought we twisted the button, it didn't work.
Is there another one over here?
No, so no worries there. So taking a look at that, let's start off a little bit. Creating new companies, getting into an existing space. How is what you do a better mousetrap? How is your company disrupting the existing markets, and how is that going to really make a difference? Katelyn, why don't you start us?
Sure. I think the short answer is people are curious. I think it's it's very interesting seeing people use this technology because I think people are curious inwardly, but outwardly they're skeptical. So I think people see these emerging tech experiences and they expect them to fail, or they expect them to be not good, or they're jaded in some way. Maybe they've done a bad experience and they have a bad taste in their mouth. But they want to see it work. Like they have a desire to try it out. So I think that, it's bad to lean on a gimmick, and you shouldn't build your marketing on a gimmick, but I think it's a good hook. And then I think once people get into a really good experience versus a not so good experience, it impacts them that much harder because they went into it curious, skeptical, maybe they've been burned in the past, and now that they have this amazing, amazing experience that's new, it's different, it's unlike anything they've seen before, now you have their attention in a completely different way because they weren't expecting to give it to you.
So, good, this one's working too. So, Alan, maybe a little something about the finance markets, especially take a look at augmented reality. How is that being seen as a contributor to companies and to consumer engagement?
Sure. So, one of the type of investments we do, is the growth equity space. And so we try to find companies that have proven business models, they're growing rapidly, and we can help support that growth. And frequently we'll come across businesses that there's a lot of excitement about, there's enthusiasm about the market. And we have to figure out whether it's a long-term trend or whether it's a fad, right? And so we've had some prior success doing that sort of thing. And so naturally we see VR and AR and we get a lot of excitement about it. But nobody really knows how it's going to be applied, right? And that's where we were sort of 3 years ago. And so now we've had the benefit of a few years seeing how consumers are going to engage with it. And there's, at least from my standpoint, a few learnings, right? One is when you think about VR, look, if you're going to put on a headset and enter this immersive world, there's some applications where that's really exciting, right? Training is an example. You think about medical training, or maybe you think about, there's examples in sports and sort of practicing, visualizing actually being in the moment. On the entertainment side, though, there's been more challenges with that, where if you're sitting down in your living room and you're going to watch a show, you may not want to commit to put on a headset. It seems like a very light, it's, maybe a 10-second, 20-second experience, but that's now a commitment. You've put it on, and consumers haven't really engaged in that way. So sort of traditional content, that hasn't proven to be particularly popular. Gaming is sort of, that's one of the places I spend time, and gaming is probably one of the best examples where that audience is already accustomed to peripherals, and so entering this sort of immersive world, people are going to commit. Sometimes, they're going to spend 2 or 3 hours. They're already, the sort of quintessential gamer in their basement, and that so sort of entering that world it may work. On the AR side, we've seen that's actually that's the lighter touch. It's a little bit easier to get people to engage in AR because you don't have to fully commit and enter. Obviously, maybe a year and a half ago, people thought Pokemon Go was going to be the watershed moment in AR, where people now had this great killer app. You were going to be super excited about everybody experimenting with AR, and now that's going to be where the rest of the world is going to jump on board. Obviously, we haven't really seen that. So I think the main takeaway for an investor is AR VR is still sort of yet to be proven out. Can it be effective on a mass scale? But certainly in very specific applications, people are having success.
Arlen, thinking about the hyper-personalization that Ellation is doing and really trying to bring a lot of that, some of the places I've seen AR talked about is in a stadium setting, in that really connecting to the fan and creating those personal experiences. Is that something that y'all are taking a look at? Is that, how does that play into it? And then, maybe how does that help monetize on the financial market there?
Sure. I think we just heard from a smarter person that the commercialization is still yet to be, and I definitely sit on the commercial end of the value chain. We have these direct-to-consumer relationships, and we provide a subscription, and in many cases, it's actually perceived as a membership. And I think as time goes on, and we believe we can add more value, we will tap into other spaces. But really being in the world that I play in this sort of more niche space, I think we're trying to fulfill a different void. So if you think about a Netflix or a Hulu, those are really utilities, which are, it fulfills a certain need, which is to be able to have affordable access to premium entertainment. I think when it comes to Crunchyroll or Rooster Teeth, you're really talking about a way to connect and a part of your identity. And so it fulfills an entirely different void, which is why I think it tilts towards membership. And so we look at, Netflix is pretty consistent in terms of saying, hey, you pay us X dollars for premium video content. Over time, you will pay us more and more money for that premium video content. I think in our world, we're tapping into all different legs of the value stool in different ways. It certainly centers around premium video, but we have e-commerce benefits, live events, merchandise, and I also mentioned games publishing and all these different ways that we're trying to deepen the engagement with that consumer and give them a better and easier path to connect to more people through this content. And so I certainly envision, particularly because of a lot of our content is animated, that we will probably experiment in the future. But usually when it gets to us, the commercial potential has already been proven as opposed to the other way around. So.
No, that sounds great, because that's one of those big areas that we have to take a look at. And Ty in the last panel was talking about how do we start taking more engagement? How do we get people to be able to connect as a community to the content and to what's going on, some of the programming, as one of the changes in the future for television. Katelyn, what are, talking about AR, what are some of the things that have worked? And then obviously, with a lot of folks from the business world and some students will be going into it, What are some of the landmines that they might want to try and avoid? What are some of those pitfalls?
Sure. So I think that you've all heard, or you've at least experienced in your own lives, that this is new tech. But I think that the most successful applications of this tech are when they're married to other tech that people understand. So I think that it's an easy trap to fall into. When you hear AR, VR, you're like, oh, that's, you need a new app and nobody downloads apps. But the fact of the matter is that Snapchat is augmented reality. Your face is real, the mouse ears that go on your head are not. That is augmented reality. Facebook is also getting into that game too. They've released Spark AR, and now they're getting AR into their cameras. I've seen a lot of really successful campaigns on both of these platforms. Jurassic Park did one for the release of the new movie. I believe Game of Thrones has one on there right now. Personally, we've done some campaigns for Dunkin' Donuts and other similar chains of that ilk. And those are the platforms that people understand, and those are the functionalities that people understand. And it's a really nice way to get people introduced to that type of interactivity, because there is an engagement there that you can't get anywhere else. There is something personal, getting back to the name of the, the panel, there's something personal about it. You see your face with the brand around you. You see the world in front of you with the brand really integrated seamlessly into it if it's done well. And I think that those are so powerful. Again, getting back to the whole people expect it to fail, and when it doesn't, it creates this wow moment that it's really hard to get nowadays.
And some of the stuff that hasn't worked well?
And some of the stuff that I know, I wanted to
we
try
like to watch the car crash
right,
in
no,
NASCAR.
I know. We do all like to watch the car crash. I think some things that have not worked well are honestly when people decide to create a whole new app for a single activation and expect it to work flawlessly. No one cares about your brand that much, I'm sorry. There's some industry professionals in the room, so I apologize if you worked on this project, but there was a Walking Dead app that came out that I felt like could have been something more if it was, if it was strategized a little bit more. I think that was a fantastic idea. It was so good. It made me so excited, but there was a little bit of a barrier there. I almost felt like it was done in reaction to seeing AR and VR splattered everywhere. I wasn't in the strategy room, I wasn't there building it, so I don't know. But as a consumer, that's how it felt, and that's what's important.
Yeah, there's, coming from the data side of the world, and anybody who reads Forrester knows, or Gartner, I can never remember, they've got the hype cycle. And I think that we're definitely on the upward trend of that hype cycle for AR and VR and stuff. And much like the same idea with big data 5-10 years ago, AI and machine learning in a lot of ways right now, can we use AI to solve the world's problems? You could do it with a linear regression. It's not going to give you peace in the Middle East, but it's give you a good probabilistic effort. So those are the things that you start to take a look at. Where have you seen financially that it's worked? And obviously we're not under NDA, so probably shouldn't be naming companies, but what's worked, what's failed, what are the things that are of interest, and how do you disrupt the market?
Sure. So obviously it's easier to talk about the ones we've actually invested in rather than what we're not doing. Actually there's a company that I think addresses, in our portfolio addresses, that question specifically about where AI has worked. And actually is a good example of personalization as a new platform. I think even on the last panel we heard, and I'm sure throughout the day, people were talking about there's all these great new platforms out there, but they need content. And how can you create this content cost effectively, particularly when you start getting a super long tail? And certainly within the sports world, that's very much been true. You have media rights that have been going up, you have subscribers going down, the ESPNs of the world are getting squeezed. And so they're thinking about how can I create more content cost effectively? And then, when you think about, we're always trying to think about, hey, who's not being served in the market? What's the underserved audiences? And so, one of the things in particular that we were interested in was, not so much the NFLs and the World Cups, but as you get further down, college sports, high school sports, youth sports, there's huge underserved audiences of people who Individually are small audiences. An individual high school football game, as an example, might be a relatively small audience compared to a Super Bowl, but collectively there's actually a large audience of folks who want to watch their kid or their community play high school football, as an example. But the question is, how can you produce that content cost effectively? So we invested about 6 months ago in a company called Pixelot, and what they do is they use AI to automatically produce games, broadcast sports games without camera crews. And so the way they do that is they have camera systems that will cover the whole field. They obviously have a proprietary hardware design, but the real secret sauce is the algorithms that they've developed where within those cameras that they're capturing the whole field, they can zoom and follow the ball and frame it with the right players who are in the play and understand the dynamic and the specific situation, and it will look like a real professional broadcast. And so the benefit of that is then you can now broadcast and produce this game with zero marginal cost. And so now not only is it the varsity game, you can do the JV game, you can do the freshman game. When there's a soccer game on that field, we have a soccer algorithm, so it's going to track the soccer that can be broadcast. You can do it in this specific company. It's somewhat unique, but they can do indoor, they can do outdoor, and there's a wide variety of sports they can do. And now that's serving this audience that otherwise was underserved and is very, from our standpoint, one of the most compelling uses of AI we've seen.
Gotcha. It sounds like something, Arlen, maybe you should be getting into your suite that you can bundle with, get all the other sports out there. And think, kind of thinking about that earlier, we'd heard from about 2 panels ago, and I hope catching the names right, but Lucinda from Untitled UTA said, we don't like it when somebody comes in and says, I've got a pitch for this demographic. And the gal from AMC saying the same thing. We don't want a product that's good for, the female 20 to 30-year-old, whatever demo that they're talking about. But rather, you want a good story and good content. One of the big things that stood out for me is, some of the questions you're asking about with Ellation is like, Rooster Teeth has helped define who I am in the different age groups. And when you see those different groupings, how do y'all approach what content to provide, what channels to bundle, or which groups to bundle with? Is it that same kind of thing, or are you looking specifically at demographics and underserved markets?
Yeah, I think, so one of the things that we talk a lot about is sort of respecting the complexity of the audience. I think, pretty frequently when I hear a pitch for something, particularly in the media space or something along those lines, it's like, we want to go after, millennials, or we want to go after, this very specific, people who love this thing. And I think in reality, if you think about any of us in the room, we all are into like some weird stuff, and it doesn't necessarily neatly overlap. I'm a big fan of the WWE and basketball. I don't know if a lot of people have that overlap or not. But I think everyone kind of has their own sort of set of overlapped interests. And I think for us, it's really, again, respecting the complexity of the audience. And so with Verve, I'll give you an example of something. We knew that the audience already has an appetite for, foreign subtitled content. Anime is imported from Japan, and we also know that they like deep, rich storytelling. And so we started to dabble with independent films, and in that particular case, we probably initially had the wrong partner, but I think that's an area that we have great interest in terms of bundling for Verve. Historically, we've distributed Korean drama on Crunchyroll, and maybe that seems natural to some of you, but I think in reality the audiences are pretty different, and so I think it's really having a deeper understanding of your audience and recognizing what they're trying to get out of this content. And like I said earlier, I don't believe that we are just purely in the entertainment business. We are really in filling a void for that audience, and it's more of an emotional relationship that they have with the content, and then they are using that content to build a social network. If you go to RTX, which is Rooster Teeth's big convention in Austin, what you realize really quickly is, yeah, the content's very important, but it's certainly not the centerpiece of that. That's like a great way for a bunch of, teens and tweens to like kiss for the first time. And that's what it really is about. And it's a group of people who may or may not feel more alienated in their particular high school or wherever they are. And then they come together and they're like, these are my people. And that connective tissue is really the content.
Gotcha. How does AR help supplement becoming that connective tissue and the work that you're doing?
Right. I think what's exciting about working in this space right now is that we are specifically going away from, traditional demos, male, female, age, region of the United States. And we're really trying to tap into the humanity of content delivery, because that's really what AR and VR is. It may be easy to think that, VR is you're in the headset, you're isolated, you can't see anybody, but the reality is that, we're only 3 years in. Like, where was Netflix 3 years into its establishment? Where was Hulu 3 years into its, where was the iPhone? Like, do you remember what an iPhone looked like in 2008? It was ridiculous. So I think that it has so much potential, and I think that the fact that we're thinking of it in a very human way, what is the human being on the other end trying to get out of this? It really is driving the content. It's really changing the way that we're creating the content. I think what's really exciting about augmented reality specifically is that it's delivering these very aspirational things to people and putting it in their worlds. Like, you could have some ridiculous painting from DiCaprio in your living room if you want to. I don't know what the business application of that would be, so I'm not selling that as a marketing tool, but the concept is there. It's bringing the aspiration to people's lives and making it real, even though it's not real, but it's people have learned to connect in that way. So I think it's really unique. I think that's how it's serving the underserved. It's literally bringing them things that they cannot get otherwise.
Gotcha. And this is one where, in my day job, when I'm not doing this, and if you read anything that I write on LinkedIn, I always try to have a focus on the customer first. My great joy in life will be when I destroy the automated voice response system, like press 1 for this, press 2 for that. If that goes away and I'm a contributor to that, I will die a happy man. All there is to it. Because that box creates a barrier between you and getting whatever you want to get done. It's about the company, it's not about you. And what we've just heard about right there is 2 great ways and 2 great opportunities to put the consumer first and to think about what they want instead of what the company wants. It's a great idea, and I think everybody in here would be shaking their head and saying, yeah, I would love to be thought of as first. But the real question is, how do you make that the bottom line? How do you make that the money? And what kind of emerging trends, what kind of emerging companies are you seeing? And is anybody pitching that to you? And if not, then you and I need to talk afterwards, because I got a business idea.
Sure. Well, look, I think one of the things Arlen was talking about is, and you were asking about, is this the demographics, right? Historically, when you think about content, people say, hey, this show, as you point out, is meant for this demographic. And one of the things that's really interesting about Netflix, they obviously hit on a lot of the trends I think we're trying to talk about in this panel, but besides creating great content and having been very successful with the direct consumer model, they're very good at the personalization. And one of the things I think you can read about, they talk about frequently is, well, historically you may have said this show, your demographic is going to be a good predictor of whether you're going to like this show. Whereas what they'll say is actually, that's a nice data point, but that's actually not meaningful. What's actually most meaningful is what you've watched previously is going to be the best predictor of what you show. So there may be shows that 13-year-olds and 70-year-olds both like, and obviously everything in between, whereas in the past people never would have thought that could be the case. And so they now have, they obviously have incredible data around that. And it's actually created a significant challenge. So one of our other companies is, we have a company called Silvergate Media, and they produce children's content. So if you have young kids out there, Octonauts, Sunny Day, new show called Hilda, though, is on Netflix. And one of the challenges, we don't, there's no ratings to know how the show is actually doing, right? So Netflix has that, they guard that very closely. We have a pretty good sense it's doing well. There's other data points you can use, but you can't point to a specific number. And so certainly we're seeing as investors, folks who are a lot of different companies are trying to figure out how to measure the new world, right? For a long time, there's been Nielsen as sort of the industry standard, which was imperfect, but at least everybody knew how to work with it. And now, how do you measure across all these different platforms? How do you measure when there's a black box and you don't actually have the information? Are there other proxies that you could potentially use? Are there apps? Are there different data points? And if you get that information, that data is extremely powerful for a wide variety of reasons. Obviously, investors want to know how shows are doing and channels are doing. Consumers, the producers want to know. Advertisers very much want to know how to reach this audience. Then they think about Netflix obviously being a subscription model. That's much more, think about how do you sell the audience to buy that subscription. But increasingly, I think we're going to see a lot more in the AVOD space, AVOD being advertising-driven video on demand. And of course, then you really need to know who's watching. You can get very personalized because you'll have all that data. But the answer is not. If you're looking to start a business, that hasn't been solved.
Gotcha. And this always brings up one of the great questions, and you can tell my Jesuit education, because I'm going to ask about the ethics of this now. And so thinking about the fact that if you do own the platform and you can see who's streaming, what are some of those considerations about using that data, especially if you know that you're working with niche markets, or in your example, you're working with kids? Where do you draw the line about using some of those demographics to say we will not target to you, or we will target to you, and how are you facing some of those privacy concerns?
As it relates certainly to, I think, Crunchyroll and Rooster Teeth, they're community-based products. Especially Rooster Teeth started from a community, and I think at the center of that is trust. And I made a comparison earlier to what we do relative to maybe a utility like a Netflix. And I certainly can't speak for Netflix, but I think you're in a different spot when your relationship to the consumer is one purely of need and of fulfilling a utility role versus where we sit, which is really a trust-based relationship with the audience. And so you were talking a little bit about thinking about putting the consumer first, and I think everything that we really do revolves around how will our audience and community react to this? And in fact, I think there's a lot of things we don't do for fear of either growing the community beyond its natural limits or alienating our core group. And I think our bigger challenge, is less about exploiting the group and more about, are we taking enough risk to push the boundaries of what this audience can be? And I sort of made a joke in the opening portion about Marvel and about what you would have perceived a comic book audience to be 20, 25 years ago. And I think the reality is those are just, age-old tales that can be applied and related to, on many levels by all of us. But I think the medium that they were being distributed in, print comics, was narrow. And so you kind of have to keep asking yourself, are you pushing the boundaries of what your audience can be? So I think, again, just to reiterate for us, I think there's a lot less risk, and I don't want to be naive. I think we try to really hold ourselves accountable, but we are very, very beholden to the audience and take that trust very seriously. I think where we sometimes fall down is whether we are pushing the boundaries enough and taking the audience on that journey with us.
Yeah, I just want to follow in with that one. Earlier, and it's ironic from when we were having our prep call, Harry Sloan, who is here, is actually one of the big owners of Bethesda, or ZeniMax, which owns the game that I play a ton, which is Elder Scrolls. And in that, you talk about offending the community, and Bethesda really made a misstep. They're known for having buggy software, and yet it's kind of endearing that something's going to go wrong. And any of you who've played a Bethesda game knows this. But when they sat there and tried to pay the people to fix it, everyone got angry. It's like, we will pay you for doing our job. Like, no, we did it for free because we like doing it. How do you test new ideas knowing that you could turn off everybody with the best of intentions?
So I think that example is a great one in terms of maybe slightly misunderstanding the relationship that you have with the audience and the role that they play. And I think when it comes to some of these more community-oriented, identity-driven types of products, like people who play Bethesda games take as a point of pride that they're buggy and that they participate in that. And I think when you try to make that commercial, you're actually destroying it. What you have is, if we ask we did a survey recently to our audience, and we did it with a research partner, and they told us that it was the highest percentage response that they had ever seen, because people would love to participate in the evolution of our product and want to have a voice. And I think the reality is, I was saying before about bringing the audience along on the journey. I think they're frankly very willing to go wherever we'll take them, as long as they are participating and are heard, even if we choose to go in a different direction, as long as they're heard. And I think Rooster Teeth is phenomenal at doing this and relating to their community. I think there are other brands that do this very well as well, like Barstool and others, where you have a two-way relationship. And I think that's really the difference between old media and new media. Old media, you're just broadcasting. We're obviously in more of a narrow casting space, but it is not one way. We have forums, we have major social channels whereby we get a ton of feedback, and sometimes we read Reddit. But I think there are tons of ways to interact with the audience, and I feel like if you're not taking advantage of that and you're trying to commercialize it, you're missing a massive opportunity to build the best mousetrap.
Yeah, I think it really, just to kind of echo the question and echo his point, I think it's not that data ethics should go out the window, because they absolutely should be on the forefront of everybody's mind. This is people's lives that you're dealing with. These aren't data points. These are human beings. So I think ethics comes into play, but I think it's more about being critical about the data that you're getting and doing critical thinking. I'm going to step outside of my area, or go back to my former life. I was in television before I decided to work in VR and AR. And just thinking about the data points that are aggregated against content that are, kind of surprising. Like thinking about the Ted Bundy documentary that came out on Netflix, the 4-part documentary. The audience there was overwhelmingly female. Yeah, that's what I said. But I'm also not that surprised, because I watched it 3 times. Once with my fiance, once with my neighbor, and once with one of my coworkers. I don't know. And I think people are looking at that being like, oh, well, women like docu-series and women like crime. So if you're a female, I'm going to push that on you. Like, that's not why I watched it. I watched it because I wanted to understand the psyche. And maybe that's why women watched it. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But there needs to be an address on what this data means. It can't just be this reactionary culture that we're in right now, and I know it's tempting because content is king. There's so many content providers. You want to be number one. You want to get ahead of your competition. I get it, but I feel like if you're going to make meaningful content and you're going to make it personal and you're going to really aggregate that audience that you're trying to aggregate, you really have to be critical about the data you're gathering. Don't just gather it to gather it.